Eddie Griffin has never been one to shy away from speaking his mind. But this time, the tone in his voice was different. In a candid, emotional moment during a recent interview, Griffin paused for a long time before uttering words that sent shockwaves through fans of both him and actor Malcolm Jamal Warner. The two have known each other for decades, their careers intersecting in the entertainment world since the 90s. Both have navigated the ups and downs of Hollywood, but few knew the bond they quietly shared away from the cameras. Eddie's face tightened, his eyes heavy, as he leaned toward the microphone and said, "I need to tell y'all something about Malcolm, because the world doesn't know what he's been carrying." The studio went silent. Even the interviewer, who had been smiling moments before, seemed frozen. Eddie began recalling late-night conversations, quiet moments backstage at comedy clubs, and times when Malcolm would appear strong in public but seemed like he was fighting invisible battles in private. "I used to think Malcolm was just tired," Eddie continued, "but it wasn't exhaustion, it was pain. And he never wanted to burden anybody." For years, Malcolm Jamal Warner, the beloved actor best known for his role as Theo Huxtable on The Cosby Show, has been in the public, smiling, acting, performing spoken word, even producing music. But Eddie revealed that behind those smiles was a reality far more difficult than fans could imagine. It wasn't just the pressures of fame or the endless grind of the industry. According to Eddie, Malcolm endured a deeply personal tragedy that changed him forever, one that he kept hidden from most people, even close friends. Eddie's voice began to crack as he hinted at sleepless nights, long phone calls, and moments where Malcolm seemed to be carrying the weight of the world. The audience could feel the gravity of what was coming. "People think fame makes you untouchable," Eddie said softly. "But pain doesn't care if you're a celebrity." And then, Eddie took a deep breath, ready to reveal the heartbreaking truth. Eddie Griffin leaned back in his chair, his hand covering his mouth for a moment, as if trying to decide whether the world was ready to hear this. Then, with a slow exhale, he spoke. "Malcolm lost someone he loved more than anything in this world." The interviewer's eyes widened, and the crew behind the cameras seemed to stiffen. Eddie explained that years ago, long before Malcolm's most recent television successes, he was in a serious relationship, one that gave him hope for a life outside of Hollywood's chaos. It wasn't just a fling, it was deep, it was real, and it was his safe place. But tragedy struck when his partner's life was suddenly cut short. The details, Eddie admitted, weren't his to give, but he described the impact as, like having the ground ripped out from under you. "I remember the day he called me," Eddie said, looking down at his hands. "I could hear it in his voice, the way a man sounds when his soul has been broken. He didn't cry loud, he didn't scream, it was worse. It was quiet. That's when you know it's real." Malcolm, according to Eddie, threw himself into work to avoid dealing with the grief. He stayed busy, smiling for cameras, taking roles, doing interviews, but behind closed doors, he was struggling. Nights of insomnia, days without eating, moments of sitting alone in his home, surrounded by memories. The saddest part? Very few people in the industry ever noticed. "Hollywood's a strange place," Eddie said. "If you show pain, people either ignore it, or they use it against you." Malcolm chose to keep it in. Eddie revealed that even now, years later, certain topics, certain songs, or even certain places can bring that grief rushing back. And though Malcolm has found ways to heal and move forward, Eddie made it clear that some wounds never fully close. Then Eddie paused again, his voice dropping lower. "And that's not even the whole story, there's something else about Malcolm that the public has never heard." The room seemed to shrink as Eddie Griffin leaned forward, lowering his voice to a near whisper. The interviewer instinctively mirrored him, as though they were sharing a secret meant for only a handful of ears. "What most people don't know," Eddie began, "is that Malcolm has been carrying more than just grief, he's been carrying responsibility." Eddie explained that after his personal tragedy, Malcolm didn't retreat into isolation completely, instead, he took on a role that most never knew about. For years, he has been quietly supporting a close family member who has battled serious health issues. No red carpet announcements. No charity gala. Just silent, relentless care. This man has been working on set, doing press tours, smiling for the world, and then going home to make sure someone he loves is okay. Every single day, Eddie said, tapping the table for emphasis. It's not glamorous. It's not what you see on Instagram. It's real life. And it's heavy. According to Eddie, Malcolm has turned down major roles because they would have taken him too far from home for too long. Opportunities that could have skyrocketed his career even further were left behind without hesitation, all so he could be there for the person who needed him most. People think the hardest part about fame is staying relevant, Eddie continued, but for Malcolm, the hardest part has been keeping his private world together while the public one keeps demanding more from him. The weight of this revelation settled over the set like a thick fog. Even the usually composed interviewer looked shaken. Eddie's voice cracked again as he added, he never wanted pity. He never wanted headlines. But I think people should know the kind of man he really is, because in a city full of selfishness, he's one of the few who's selfless. Eddie then leaned back, as though a weight had lifted from his own chest, and said quietly, and you know what? That's still not the end of what Malcolm's been through. Eddie Griffin's eyes seemed to darken as he prepared to share the next part of Malcolm Jamal Warner's story. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the lights overhead became noticeable. What really breaks my heart, Eddie said slowly, is that while Malcolm was dealing with all this, the grief, the caretaking, the sacrifices, he still had to endure the ugly side of Hollywood. Eddie described moments when Malcolm, despite being a respected veteran of the industry, was overlooked for roles he was more than qualified for. I've seen him walk into auditions where people didn't even look up from their phones. I've seen producers pass him over because they wanted a new face, even though he had more talent in his little finger than half the people they hired. And then there was the Whisper Network. Eddie claimed that certain industry insiders had quietly labeled Malcolm as difficult, not because he was unprofessional, but because he refused to compromise on his values. He wouldn't play the game. He wouldn't smile at people who disrespected him. And in this business, if you don't kiss the right rings, you get frozen out. The most painful part, Eddie said, was that this treatment often came while Malcolm was juggling his most difficult personal responsibilities. Imagine, you're barely sleeping, your heart's still broken, you're taking care of someone you love, and then people try to make you feel like you don't matter. Eddie's voice grew firm, almost protective. But here's what they don't get, you can't break a man like Malcolm. You can bruise him, you can slow him down, but you can't make him quit. He's too damn strong for that. The way Eddie spoke, it was clear that this wasn't just gossip, this was admiration. He wasn't telling this story to tear anyone down, but to show the depth of a man the public only thinks they know. And then Eddie dropped one final hint that made the interviewer's jaw drop, there's one more thing, something Malcolm's been keeping completely secret, even from most of his friends. And when people hear it, they're gonna see him in a whole new light. Eddie Griffin sat back for a moment, the weight of everything he'd said hanging in the air. Then, with a deep inhale, he leaned forward again, this time with a look that was part sadness, part pride. What I'm about to tell you. Malcolm never talks about, Eddie began. And I'm not saying this to expose him, I'm saying it because people deserve to know the kind of man he truly is. Eddie revealed that in the midst of all his personal losses, career setbacks, and quiet sacrifices, Malcolm Jamal Warner has been secretly funding education programs for underprivileged kids, many of whom have no idea he's the one behind them. He doesn't put his name on it. He doesn't call the press. He just writes the checks and makes sure those kids get books, tutors, and a real chance at a future, Eddie said, his voice softening. Some of these kids have gone on to college, some have become artists, teachers, even engineers, and they'll never know that the reason they had that opportunity was because of Malcolm. Eddie explained that this was Malcolm's way of honoring the memory of the person he lost, a quiet tribute that turned his pain into something good for others. He told me once, if I can stop someone else from feeling that kind of loss, even in a small way, it's worth it. The interviewer, visibly moved, struggled to speak. Eddie's words had painted a picture of a man far more complex, far more compassionate, and far more resilient than most of Hollywood's polished images. Eddie finished with a small, sad smile. Malcolm's been through hell. But instead of letting it turn him bitter, he found a way to turn it into love for people he doesn't even know. That's rare. That's beautiful. And that's why I'll always respect him. The cameras kept rolling, but in that moment, it didn't feel like a celebrity interview anymore. It felt like a tribute, one friend making sure the world saw the quiet hero he's known all along. By now, the atmosphere in the studio was heavy. The crew had stopped moving around, the cameras almost felt like they were intruding on something deeply personal. Eddie Griffin leaned back in his chair, staring at a spot on the floor as though replaying years of memories. What people don't get, Eddie said after a long pause, is that the strongest people you know are often the ones who cry in the dark. He explained that even after all Malcolm Jamal Warner had endured, the devastating personal loss, the years of silent caretaking, the quiet charity work, there were still moments when the weight almost crushed him. Eddie described nights when Malcolm would call him, his voice low and tired, just needing someone to listen. Sometimes we didn't even talk. We'd just be on the phone. Two men, in silence. Because sometimes silence is the only thing that doesn't hurt. Eddie then revealed something even more personal, that Malcolm had battled periods of deep depression. Not the kind the tabloids sensationalize, but the quiet, invisible kind that can slowly drain a person without anyone noticing. He never wanted medication headlines, therapy rumors, none of that, Eddie said. He handled it his way. Music, poetry, prayer, and a couple of close friends he could trust. The resilience Malcolm showed, Eddie said, wasn't about never breaking down, it was about finding the strength to stand back up every single time life knocked him over. It's easy to smile when things are good. Try smiling when your heart's shattered. That's what makes a man strong. Eddie looked directly into the camera for the first time during the interview. If you're watching this, Malcolm, I just want you to know, I see you. And I'm proud of you. The world should be, too. The studio fell into silence again. The interviewer, clearly moved, simply nodded, letting Eddie's words be the final note. But the feeling in that room made it clear, the story of Malcolm Jamal Warner wasn't just one of fame, it was one of endurance, quiet courage, and a heart that refuses to stop giving. When the interview finally aired, it was as if the entire internet stopped for a moment. Clips of Eddie Griffin's emotional revelations about Malcolm Jamal Warner flooded social media within hours. Hashtags bearing Malcolm's name began trending worldwide, not because of a scandal, but because of something far rarer in Hollywood, respect. Eddie recalled later how his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I had comedians calling me, actors, even old producers I haven't spoken to in years, all saying the same thing, I had no idea. Fans, both young and old, took to Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok to share personal stories about how Malcolm's work had impacted their lives. Some posted clips from The Cosby Show, remembering how Theo Huxtable felt like the big brother they never had. Others shared snippets of his poetry and music, saying his words had gotten them through dark times without even knowing the man behind them was fighting his own battles. But perhaps the most emotional responses came from people who had unknowingly been touched by his quiet charity work. A few former students, now adults, began piecing together that the mysterious donor who had helped fund their schooling might have been Malcolm. One post in particular went viral, "If this is true, then Malcolm Jamal Warner paid for my textbooks my freshman year. I never knew who helped me until now. Thank you, sir, you changed my life." Eddie said the most powerful moment for him came 2 days after the interview aired, when Malcolm himself finally called. He laughed and said, "Man, you just blew up my spot," but I could hear it in his voice, he was touched. He told me, maybe it's okay that people know now. Maybe it'll help somebody else. In the days that followed, Hollywood began to see Malcolm differently. Not just as an actor from a beloved sitcom, not just as a talented musician or poet, but as a man whose greatest role has always been the one off camera, a protector, a giver, and a survivor. And Eddie's closing words in a follow-up interview summed it up best: "In this industry, fame fades fast. But character? That's forever. And Malcolm's got more of it than anyone I know." Weeks after Eddie Griffin's interview, the ripple effect was still being felt. Entertainment blogs that normally chased scandal were instead publishing think pieces about kindness, resilience, and the quiet sacrifices that rarely make headlines. Malcolm Jamal Warner, a man who had spent years avoiding the spotlight when it came to his personal life, was now being celebrated for exactly that, his private integrity. Publicists from other celebrities began reaching out to Eddie, saying that his words had inspired their clients to be more open about their own struggles. "It's rare in this town for a positive story to get traction," Eddie told one outlet. "Usually, it's the drama that sells. But this was different. This was about the human being behind the name." Malcolm himself remained humble. In his first public comment since the interview, he posted a simple message on Instagram alongside a black and white photo of himself in a quiet cafe: "Thank you for the love. If you took anything from what Eddie shared, let it be this: take care of each other, even when no one's watching." The post exploded, with thousands of comments pouring in. Former co-stars, musicians, and fans from around the globe left heartfelt messages. Some shared personal struggles, others promised to pay kindness forward in his honor. Eddie later revealed that Malcolm had been overwhelmed, not by fame, but by the sheer volume of genuine human connection the interview had sparked. "He told me, I didn't realize people cared like that. I didn't realize they'd still be listening." Meanwhile, charities that Malcolm had quietly supported began receiving an influx of donations from people who simply wrote, "For Malcolm," in the notes. It was as if the truth about his private generosity had given people permission to believe in something pure again. And in the midst of it all, Eddie made one final observation that stuck with everyone who heard it: "In Hollywood, legends are usually made on the screen. Malcolm became one off the screen, and that's the kind that lasts forever." It had been almost 2 months since Eddie Griffin's interview went viral, but the two men still hadn't met face to face since that day. Eddie had been traveling for comedy gigs, Malcolm busy with filming and personal commitments. But when their schedules finally aligned, they decided to meet somewhere far from the flashing cameras, a small, quiet jazz lounge in Los Angeles that both had loved for years. The room was dimly lit, the scent of polished wood and old vinyl records hanging in the air. A live trio played softly in the corner, the upright bass vibrating gently through the floor. Eddie was already seated at a corner booth when Malcolm walked in, wearing a simple black jacket and a calm smile. They greeted each other not with words at first, but with a long, firm handshake that turned into a hug. Eddie patted Malcolm's back. "You good?" he asked, looking him in the eye. Malcolm chuckled softly. "I'm better," he replied. "And I guess I've got you to thank for that." They talked for hours, not about Hollywood, not about fame, but about life. Eddie confessed that he'd worried about overstepping when he shared Malcolm's private struggles, but Malcolm shook his head. "You didn't hurt me, man. You reminded me that people still care. And maybe I needed that reminder." At one point, the bass player launched into a slow, soulful rendition of "Ain't No Sunshine," and both men fell silent, just listening. The song seemed to capture everything they'd been through: loss, resilience, and the quiet comfort of knowing someone else understands your journey. By the end of the night, Malcolm stood, placed a hand on Eddie's shoulder, and said something the cameras would never capture: "Whatever happens next, I want you to know you told my story right. And I'll always be grateful." As Malcolm walked out into the cool night air, Eddie watched him go, knowing the man's life hadn't suddenly become easy, but also knowing he was no longer carrying it alone.